Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. So, I couldn't figure out how to record the meeting, so I'm going to be recording this on the side with my phone. So I'm sorry that all the questions are not going to be in the recording. But anyhow, welcome. It's a very fascinating topic of the Daled Olam Asiyah. Whenever I put out my podcast, I always like to say it's new chaimer. I say find that in an all new share. This one is actually probably going to go much sooner because I feel like I'm always talking about the Daled Olam Asiyah. And I mean, Chassidus is always talking about the Daled Olam Asiyah. And we never properly get into what they are, at least most places don't, unless you have a mimer that's particularly focusing on one aspect or the other. You don't have many places where it's just discuss these four things, what they are. So, to take a note out of the mimer, I think it's important to just go through one idea before we actually get into the chaimer. The chaimer is going to be this thing, which is a book from, it's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe. They blew it up into a whole book. I think it's more than 50% filler. That being said, it's a very interesting letter. I looked it up in the original. I actually appreciate the original more than the translation in a certain way, which I'll get to in Hashem soon. But anyhow, just to start, we have these four worlds of Abiyah: Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. And Atzilus is typically translated as the world of emanation, Beriyah as the world of creation, Yetzirah as the world of formation, and Asiyah as the world of action. Now, when's the first time that we started hearing about these four worlds? It's a very important question to be asking, because if you look in Torah, you have maybe some vague references to the notion, but it's more the kind of thing that you could say is put in after the fact. It says about Moshe Rabbeinu that when Hashem wanted to give nevuah to elders of the Yidden, he said, that I'm going to emanate from the Spirit that's upon you, and it's going to go on to them, and thereby they will receive prophecy. Does this mean that Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah was in the world of Atzilus, and that Hashem was taking from the world of Atzilus and emanating? It could be argued that. You could say that that's an implication, that's a remez, that's a hint, but it's very hard to say that that's a reference to a proper world of Atzilus. The reason why I'm focusing on Atzilus, by the way, is because the worlds of Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah are practically speaking taken from a pasuk, which we all know and love from Beriyah. It's from Nach, but we know it from Beriyah. Anything that calls out for my name and for my honor, says Hashem, I have created it, I have formed it, and I have made it. So these three Lashonos come up all the time. The concept of Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah are phrases that come across by Chazal very, very frequently. However, Atzilus is something that we don't see so often. So, people like to say that there's a reference to a pasuk in Yecheskel from Parak and Beis. That's something maybe, but it doesn't seem to be directly referencing a world properly. We see in Torah very early on the concept of there being realms that are quote unquote higher than ours. We see in Torah that after Matan Torah it says that the Yidden looked up at Hashem and they saw V'sachas raglov k'masa livnas hasaper v'cha'etzem hashamayim l'teir. They saw that beneath his feet were like bricks of sapphire and like the essence of the sky in a very pure congealed form almost. What this means, it's a physical explanation or a physical description of a spiritual phenomena, but essentially the Yidden were looking up, they saw that there's something higher. Some people would take this to mean that they looked up and they saw an outer space. They saw that there was a chair and Hashem was sitting, his feet were dangling, chas v'shalom. I feel very uncomfortable giving that description. The Rambam would feel uncomfortable giving that description. However, it's very easy and possible to say that there are people that for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, that did believe this. The Rayatz himself comments on the Rambam when the Rambam says that the idea of giving anthropomorphic descriptions of Hashem are purely descriptive, they're not literal. The Rayatz comments that a lot of people actually did understand, they did believe that Hashem had some kind of physical manifestation, whatever that was supposed to mean. I'm not the Rayatz's friends, I don't know what exactly it's referring to. I had to say that there's a physical manifestation of Hashem, but this is what the Rayatz said. So when we look through history, this idea of there being a world that's above our world, some people took that in a literal sense. we see the concept of different levels of revelation coming up in Nach. We see the concept that there was a nevuah of Yeshaya, and there was a nevuah of Yecheskel, and there was a nevuah of Zechariah. And all three of them saw roughly the same kind of thing. They saw different malachim flying around doing different things. But we say that the nevuah of Yeshaya was a very lofty kind of nevuah. We say that it's comparable to a minister seeing what goes on in the palace. He sees everything that's going on inside. Then we say that the nevuah of Yecheskel, the Meiser Merkava, which people know and love, the Haftarah of Shavuos, the first day of Shavuos, Meiser Merkava is like a city person that goes and sees the palace and is very impressed with everything going on, but it's not like he has the insider information on what's going on in the palace. He just sees it and he's impressed. So Yecheskel was quote-unquote on a lower level. Zechariah's nevuah was on an even lower level. He saw things with horses. It was a very, almost a grab and mashal, if you could say that about a nevuah of Zechariah. But the point is that everyone saw different things in different levels. So you have a concept of being able to appreciate godliness in different levels, but it wasn't really fleshed out as the idea of worlds per se. Now, the concept of spheres, which is not the subject of the shirim over here, the concept of spheres get more direct references in Tanakh, whether or not it's by those names, although you do have most of the names of the spheres that we typically reference, Chasidic Heritage Series, Netzach, Yisod, and Malchus. Their names are mentioned in Tanakh, their names are mentioned in Chazal, their names are mentioned in Sefer Yetzirah. They definitely have their roots, and it's definitely something that goes back for a very long time. But the concept of the world, the concept of Atzilus, for example, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, as being terms that people throw around for Hashem did create the world, Hashem formed the world, and Hashem made the world. So they're all things that go around, but the concept of there being worlds that bear these names doesn't seem to come up until quite later. There's a very vague reference in the Kuzari. Sorry, I should back up a second. There is a book called Maseches Atzilus. We don't know when it's from. Some people want to claim that it's, I believe the earliest claim I've seen is that it was written by someone in David HaMelech's times. I don't know or see anything to substantiate it, and it doesn't seem to come up as a term across Chazal, in Midrashim, or anything like that. The Kuzari, from the year 1140, does have a vague reference to the idea. Over there it says, "Va'akil shavel asiba rishona levav kavana mimana avol hu atzilus natzelis mimana siba shines va'achar kach shlishis revius v'stabku asibis v'masevu v'shtadu kasher ata reya isam." So he says essentially that there's a first kind of cause, and he does refer to it as hu atzilus, that it is atzilus. He doesn't necessarily frame it as a world, and he doesn't frame it as a world existing vis-a-vis three other worlds. He does, interestingly, have the idea of Siba, Shenis, Shlishis, and Revius, which also you could say is an implication for the further worlds of Beriyah and Yetzirah and Asiyah. But this is what we have from the Kuzari, a little bit vague. The Rayatz, technically, you could argue, has a reference to it. There's a commentary of Sefer Yetzirah that is miyuchas to the Rayatz, that people claim is from the Rayatz. But the thing is that it turns out that commentary from Sefer Yetzirah is almost certainly not from the Rayatz, and it was just misattributed. So it's very hard to say that that's from the Rayatz. The Rayatz may be arguably a little bit earlier than the Kuzari. But regardless, the Ramban, once you get to the Ramban is loaded with references to four worlds, Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, Asiyah. You have maybe a reference in Rambam in his Perishah Mishnayos, but it's very hard to say because Rambam Perishah Mishnayos was actually translated from Arabic. It's possible that the translation happened at a later point. It's possible that the translator was already familiar with the concept of Atzilus from other places, and he decided to put it in. By the way, there's a reason why I'm going through the history. I'll make it apparent in Rayatz Hashem soon. I'll get into it. But yeah, this is just an important historical background. By the time of the Ramban, it seemed to have come around. You have references in the Zohar. The Zohar is famously the subject of much controversy about its origin. Even if its origin, you would say, is from Rashbi, it's still controversial about whether or not there are explanations that are given in the Zohar that come from outside sources, or explanations that are given which are completely congruent with the taken of the Zohar, with the content of the Zohar, but at the same time were put into the words of the people that gave the explanations. It's possible translations have happened over centuries or millennium. I have no idea. I'm not an expert on the Zohar. I personally believe the Zohar goes all the way back to Rashbi. I'm a Lubavitcher Chassid. This is typically the stance taken in Chabad. That being said, it's something to bear in mind. And also, To say that it was a known thing throughout rabbinical literature is definitely difficult, because the Zohar was not a known thing throughout rabbinical literature until the 1300s. That much is certain. So now we get into what exactly we're referring to when we say the four worlds. Obviously, this is going to be the subject of 7 share series in Mirz Hashem. But in general, when we use the terms Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, even in Chassidus, something that happens very often is we throw in the terms almost what you would say is l'ravcha de milsa, which I guess an English translation of that would be to broaden the concept. Very often the subject of discussion is not necessarily these four worlds, but you're trying to describe something else, and you're trying to say, how this fits into a grand scheme of things. So like, for example, we say that neshamas come from the highest source in these worlds. What would the highest source in these worlds be? We would say it's Atzilus, and that is Taka, where neshamas are from. Atzilus is the highest representation of the manifestation of the world. I don't want to start getting too much into the spoilers of what we're going to be discussing about all the details of the world. But the point is that you say the neshama, and we're discussing the origin of the neshama, we'll throw in that it's from Atzilus. We'll say another concept is that we'll say the world of Atzilus corresponds to Chachma, and the world of Beriyah to Bina, and the world of Yetzirah to the 6 Midos, and the world of Asiyah to Malchus. And these are all comparisons that we make, and if you're very familiar with Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, then it really helps with understanding the spheres in this way. But the point that I'm trying to bring out is that we very often say these four worlds as a way of comparison, almost like what you would say is stelling terms, that you're trying to put out the terminology so you can have everything lined up in a very congruent manner. The same way that you have Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, you have also different combinations of four things. You have 4 letters of Hashem's name. You have many different examples of how we use the terms Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah to refer to other things, to say that they're in a similar level of scale. So now that we're here, I think that we can start getting into the teichin of what we're going to be discussing, the letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So this was a letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe from a certain Rabbi Horowitz. I don't know if he was a practicing rabbi. Someone named Rabbi Horowitz from Vilna wrote a letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he wanted to understand these four worlds. And I think there's a very fascinating diuk to be made in the way that the question is framed in the letter, and I think that really it's going to be the point of today's share, also to get into the answer of the Frierdiker Rebbe in a very general way. But with this background, I think we'll be able to appreciate the question in a whole other level that we wouldn't necessarily be able to appreciate before. So I'll just read the letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and I'll translate, and then I'll discuss a little bit how these things apply. So, Baruch Hashem, Tesvav Mar Cheshvan, Taf Reish Ches Tzadik. To say Taf Reish Tzadik Ches would be to say Tirtzach, which Tirtzach means to murder, so we don't want to have that. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, he switches around. The letter is a common thing that people do. But Otwok, this was when the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Otwok in Poland. I don't know how you pronounce that, I'm not Polish. But anyhow, Shalom Uvracha. Peace and blessing. B'mayna al Machtavai, to answer your letter. Knowing how you'll be likri zekernesa v'edis deidi harazal, Reb Zalman Aaron, Nishmasi Edin, v'miesh esle rishima sipurim ashashama me'itay, is anyan likri esam. He says in response to your letter, it was very sweet to me, it was very pleasant to me to read your memoirs regarding my uncle, Reb Zalman Aaron. His soul is in Eden. And if you have any stories recorded from him, any stories which you've heard from him recorded, I would be very appreciative to read them. That's the introduction. But mine al shaylasay, to answer your question. Im afshar lahavin as a musag oilamais zelamay lemizah kivshotay. In regards to, are you able to understand the concept of worlds, one on top of the other, in its simple form? That is to say, in space. That is to say, that in physical space, there are worlds an infinite amount. However, it's understood from Tanya, the second part, chapter 7, which Vayishkach Pratis we went through in this past week in Tanya. We can't understand in this a concept of space, of Shetak literally means planular space, as in a plane as opposed to a volume, or a grasping of place. So we can't understand that these four worlds, according to what it says in Tanya, in part 2, in chapter 7, that these worlds exist in a physical manner, that they exist in a way of space, that you can't actually take a rocket ship up, and if you go 50,000 light years to the left, you'll end up reaching the world of Beriyah. It's not how it works, according to Tanya. And then there's brackets, and I'm going to focus on these brackets for a little bit, because I think it's very important. But in the bracket it says, in Cain, if this is the case, in what way are they divided one from the other? And then, another question, which that in itself is the I'll get to that, Blineder. That's all. Those last three words are also in brackets. He says, how is it possible to understand vis-a-vis the Ein Sof, the infinite light, which we refer to as being the main manifestation of Hashem in this world? You could almost say it's Hashem himself. That in itself is a whole long story. But how can we relate to this vis-a-vis the light of Hashem, which fills all worlds and surrounds all worlds? Two concepts which are discussed at length in Chassidus. And the Frierdiker Rebbe adds in brackets, that is to say, the distinction between them. So, if we back up a second, the first thing that I want to point out is that in this English translation that I'm using, for better or for worse, they decided to put in a paragraph break. After Adin Kates, they noted that there's not a period after Ein Kates, there's a comma, which is in the original letter, if I'm not mistaken. They made a paragraph break. It's an interesting choice, and I don't know if they were intentional about the implication of this or not, but the implication of this is that there's two separate points, or maybe it's all just one point, but that somehow in the first part, there's one point being made, and then in the second part, there's another point being made. And if I had to put it in a paragraph break, I would actually put it in after the first set of brackets. I would like to read this again, after having translated the whole thing. I would like to read it again without the brackets, and to point out something very interesting about the way the Frierdiker Rebbe is writing. So imagine that you're Rabbi Horowitz, and you're writing a letter to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Now, Rabbi Horowitz is from Vilna. I have no idea if he's a Chassid or if he's not a Chassid. I have no idea if he knows Kabbalah or not. But he's writing to the Frierdiker Rebbe. And imagine with the historical context, I'm going to read it again, and just try to think about what's going on over here. His question is, I'll read it in English. Is it possible to understand the concept of worlds, one above the other, in a simple way? That is to say, spatially. That is to say, that there is an existence in space of infinite worlds. However, in Tanya, chapter 2, part 2, chapter 7, it says that you can't understand this as being a reference to physical space, as taking up physical space. And also, how is it possible to understand this relative to the concept of the infinite light that fills all worlds and surrounds all worlds? So, when we take it with a grain of historical context, it could very well be understood that this Rabbi Horowitz is writing to the Frierdiker Rebbe not knowing what these four worlds are at all. Remember, these concepts, I'm pulling up a book from the Frierdiker Rebbe, a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe where he explains this. There's not many sources in Chassidus that explain this concept well, properly, in a fleshed out way. Just an encyclopedia of what is Atzilus, Beriyah, and Yetzirah, and Asiyah. You can get references from different places, but there isn't anything fully spelled out. It is entirely possible that this Rabbi Horowitz writing, it's possible that it's not, but it would seem if you take out the brackets, that this Rabbi Horowitz is writing coming from a place that he doesn't know what these four worlds are. And it's possible that until he learned Tanya, part 2, chapter 7, that he thought that these four worlds were references to actual places. That if you go up 50,000 light years and you go to the left, you'll end up bumping into Beriyah. So the way that he's writing is that I ran myself into a contradiction or into a problem in my understanding, because I was always under the impression that if you go up high enough, you'll get to one of these worlds, that there exists a physical space. Hashem put it very far removed. You can maybe even say another universe, whatever, but that there is a notion of physical space that applies to these four worlds. And if you go far enough, you'll get there. But then Tanya says no. So he's confused. And then he says, if you're going to start telling me that it's a spiritual concept, then I have another question. Because in general, we say there's two spiritual levels of how Hashem relates to the world. One of Mimalik Alman and one of Seviv Alman, which are both, I don't think we'll actually have to be getting into it in the course of this. But if you're telling me that there's a concept of different spiritual levels, I already know about that concept from the concept of Mimalik Alman and Seviv Alman. Mimalik Alman, in general, we say, is many, many different levels. And Seva Ka'omen is one more general, encompassing level. It's implied in the names. So that's the concept that we're familiar with. Why are you throwing in this concept of worlds? If you were saying that it's a physical manifestation, fine, I hear, that's what I always thought. But now that I'm here, I realize I don't understand what's going on. So that's the question of Rabbi Horowitz. If you take it without the brackets, if you take it with a grain of salt, if you take it with the historical context, that it's entirely possible that those that were unaffiliated, those that didn't spend a lot of time learning Chassidus and Kabbalah, etc., it's entirely possible that they simply didn't know what was going on with these four worlds, as is the case probably with most people nowadays. I discussed once with a person who is of the Masadish influence, someone that's very knowledgeable, and he told me that he read a whole book, an encyclopedia of sorts, about all of the spiritual Kabbalistic levels. And he said that he was familiar with all of the ins and outs, and I spoke to him for a while, and he did seem to be more or less familiar with the ins and outs. So then I asked him, I said, a very practical question is, can you tell me where Atzilus is? How does Atzilus relate to this world? And to that, he said he doesn't know. He knew the concept, he knew where Atzilus is relative to the concept of Beriyah, maybe where Atzilus is relative to the concept of Asiyah, but how it relates to our actual practical world, the world that we're living in, the world that we're breathing and existing in, he didn't know. And it's very possible that this Rabbi Horowitz was coming from this context. If we read it again with the brackets, we see that the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's possible the Frierdiker Rebbe knew that he was a massive London, and that he was asking really these deep questions, and he added in the words in brackets to give context to what he was saying, so that he shouldn't seem like the person that we thought he was, perhaps, without the brackets. It's also possible that the Frierdiker Rebbe took this as an opportunity to explain the four worlds, because he saw the lack, and he decided to give it much more depth by reframing the questions with much deeper insight. Now, I'd like to read it again with the brackets, and to point out this new distinct difference. So he says, is it possible to understand the concept of worlds one on top of the other in a simple manner? That is to say, spatially, that is to say that they occupy physical space. According to what's understood in Tanya part 2, chapter 7, we can't understand that there exists by them a concept of division, distinct occupation of space. If this is the case, what distinguishes the worlds one from the other? So the Frierdiker Rebbe took this point and made it into a very well-developed and fleshed-out question. He says, the concept of worlds, you would say, means that if you have more than one world, it's two different spaces. That's how we would refer to it, being physical beings. Living in physical dwellings. We appreciate that one place is distinct from another place because they occupy different spaces. My house and outside of my house are two different places. They occupy two different places in physical space. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I've turned your question now into a much more educated question of, if we've dropped the idea of saying that they occupy different spaces, what is it that distinguishes one world from another? We would say that all of the world, and we do say in Chassidus, that all of the worlds flow one into the other. They're all interconnected. Malchus of Atzilus is Keser Beriyah, that there's no distinct beginning and end. So he says if there's no distinct beginning and end, then they're all occupying the same space, because there's no distinction in space. What is it to say that Atzilus is any different from Beriyah, or than Yetzirah, or than Asiyah? What makes it that they're different worlds? If you want to tell me there are different levels, different appreciations you can have, two different aspects of the fact that I have, my jacket has both a color and a temperature, you could say that they're referring to two different things, but they're not two different worlds. They're just two different adjectives for my jacket. What is it that makes that you have these worlds that they're distinct to the point that you're calling them worlds? If they don't have this crucial point that we use to distinguish two worlds, which are that they occupy different places in space. Now it's an educated question. Now it's a question that we can discuss for pages and pages to be able to come to a good, solid, and geshmaka answer. Then, another question. I don't know if this was part of the original intention of the writer. It's possible the Frierdiker Rebbe put this in to make it into a distinct question, to deal with it separately. But he says, once I've gotten to this point where I understand and I appreciate that the worlds don't occupy a physical space, now that I'm here, and I say that they're spiritual levels, one flowing into the other, how is this in any way different from Malik Olam and Seva Ka'omen? How is this in any way different from the concept in Malik Olam that we say that each level flows into the next level and influences the next level, and ultimately it's all a manifestation going all the way back, it's like a chain, etc. How is it any different? What is the distinction? Not to say that I didn't know. I'm coming from a place of not knowing. He's saying, I understand that I appreciate that there's four worlds. I understand that I appreciate that there's Mamale and there's Seviv. What is the distinction between the two of them? Okay, so now that we're at this place, the Frierdiker Rebbe took this question from Rabbi Horowitz, and he turned it into, now this is a vessel. I'm able to launch a whole explanation of the four worlds of Abiyah. So this was all the question of Rabbi Horowitz. And now we go on to the answer of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So he says, Tshuva. It says in the Zayar, Hashem created the lower world similar to the upper world. That is to say that this physical world is similar to, and it's like an example of the upper spiritual world. The Heavenly Academy and its order of study. The halls of the righteous. That they call out, make way. And the order of receiving the face of the arriving souls of the righteous. The elevations of Moshe Rabbeinu, the mind to upper realms. The elevation of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and his question, a concept which is from, I'll explain all of these soon. Bikurei Shal Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi began Eden, Aliyas Neshama Shal Arizal, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi going off to Gan Eden, the Neshama of the Arizal going up, Merino Abal Shem Tev, and also the elevations of the Baal Shem Tev. Chaziyeni Heid Kved Kedushas Aviseinu, Rabbiseinu, Rakadeshim, Zecher Tzadikim, Kedushin the Rachel Achaya Lam Aban, Nishmasim Migin Zemiremim, Zechus Yagin Aleinu. The elevations also of our holy forebears, the Rabbeim, may their spirits rest upon us. We'll say this about the Frierdiker Rebbe himself as well, and as well as the Rebbe. All of these attest to the fact that the Seder, the order of things above, is similar to the order of things below. So, just to explain all these references, the concept of Masifta Derkiah is a concept which is discussed throughout Shas. It comes up. There's apparently a heavenly academy where people sit and learn. That's Gan Eden. Gan Eden, the spoiler alert is that you're sitting and learning. So, the Masifta of the Rakia is a concept which comes up all the time in Gemara. The concept of the holes of the Tzadikim, which is another concept that comes up. What? Okay. So, the concept of the holes of the Tzadikim is another concept that comes up. The elevation of Moshe Rabbeinu on high is a concept in Midrashim. There's full Midrashim written about it. A very well-known concept in Divrei Chazal. The elevation of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and his question says that Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol would go up and ask questions to Hashem. Not all. The famous one is the one that is very commonly said at Yom Kippur, that he went up and asked Hashem about the Sarah Malchus if they should submit themselves to the authorities to become martyrs. So another concept that we have from Chazal. The visit of Rabbi Shua ben Levi in Gan Eden is a midrash, an agada, that Rabbi Shua ben Levi tricked the Malach HaMavis into letting him visit Gan Eden. He saw how things were going on over there, and also you see the concept of worlds existing more or less in a similar order to the way that our worlds exist. And then he says something that was more practical, more on the consciousness of people in those times. It's also more on the consciousness of people nowadays, of the elevations of the Arizal. The Arizal would go up the Maila and he'd have these great, fantastic visions. And from the way that it's described, it would seem that these visions are a world that corresponds to our world. Maybe not when he would say that he sees something or other, he's not referring to a physical something or other. But still, the fact that he's referring to it in terms that we're able to understand would imply that there's some kind of Seder that's similar to our world down here. It happens to be the story of the Arizal, wherein he says that he couldn't possibly describe everything that went on up there, but it wasn't for a lack of ability to explain per se. It was about a lack of ability of time, because he said everything was, you can appreciate so much when you see more than when you say, and you're not able to appreciate, you can't give over everything that happened up there in the short amount of time that we have in our lifetimes. But that's the elevation of the Arizal. The Arizal was a very influential figure, and everyone knew that, the Arizal would go up and he would see things. The same thing with the Baal Shem Tov. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe says, even the Arabim, that they would have Dekus, they would go up the Maila, and the point is that everything seems to follow the same order of things down here. everything corresponds to this world. So then he says, Omnam, Emre ki gavna da olmei la. The Zohar's phrase that we quoted before, that it says that everything down here is similar to what goes on in the upper realms. Hine hakavana hu shehu rak b'dmus olam ha'elyon ulad. That is to say that it's only in the form of an upper world. It's not literally like the upper world. The upper world is spiritual. This lower world is physical and materialistic. It's only similar in a manner of speaking to the upper world, because over here you hit the table and there's a table over there. Up there, it's not a physical world. It's not a world that has physical existences. Everything is a spiritual concept, relation, but it's not physically there. It's an important distinction to be making. It's not that when we say there are upper worlds that they have physical expressions. And the reason why this is kind of important is to kind of answer the question, the perhaps original question of, I originally thought that you go 50,000 miles up and then to the left and you bump into Beriyah. If that would be the case, you could put something there, you could bump into it, and you can move it, you can manipulate it physically over there. So that concept is definitely out of the question based on the wording of the Zohar about the upper worlds. This is to say, says the Frierdiker Rebbe, the difference between the upper world and the lower world is only in this, that the lower world is physical and materialistic, and the upper world is spiritual, it is pure, and it is refined, it is clear. The Frierdiker Rebbe now gets into the very core of what we're discussing. He says, so far I've made a lot of references to different concepts. Maybe you weren't convinced until this point about the existence of upper worlds that exist in a different kind of way. He says, I'm going to bring you one Ma'amar Chazal to tell you the concept of worlds and to almost explain to you why we're forced to say this, why we need to say this. He says, it says in the Pasuk in Shir Hashirim that there are many fish in the sea. There are Alamis in Mispar, but Achasi Yenasi Samasi, that Hashem says to the Yidden, you are my one, you're my chosen, etc. But the Chachamim have a drasha on the Pasuk of Alamis in Mispar. Don't say that there's a lot of girls in the world. Say, Elamis in Mispar. There's an infinite amount of worlds. Shehem Elamis ad ein Mispar. Hainu Shehem bli gvul. That is to say, there's no boundary to how many worlds there are. Da gvul ba Mispar, because boundaries come with numbers. Va bli gvul in le Mispar. The unlimited has no numbers. The Frierdiker Rebbe says that we have this concept of spiritual worlds to an infinite degree. Everything in this world has a boundary. Everything in this world has an end. These worlds have no end. And thereby they don't exist in physical space. Because you keep on going, you keep on going, you keep on going, and you try to add and add and add. Ultimately, you can go and go and go. But you'll end up reaching some new point. You'll end up reaching the new limitation, the new boundary. The Frierdiker Rebbe says, Alam Yisrael Misra, there is an infinite amount of worlds, and perforce these worlds are referring to a spiritual concept. In Yetzirah, and now the Frierdiker Rebbe gets into, this is where this is where the mind gets blown about the four worlds. Seeing as the worlds are without boundary and without number, so these infinite worlds are divided into two categories. Omen disgalion, for omen simin the law esgalion. Worlds which are revealed, and worlds which are hidden and not revealed. A quote from Tikkun Ezer, Pesach Halio. And they're divided into four divisions, one from the other. And he says these are called Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. What's the Frierdiker Rebbe saying? The Frierdiker Rebbe is saying that he's, in a sense, he's giving context to the entire history of the four worlds. A person might have been under the impression that the four worlds were invented by some Kabbalists in the 11th century to sell more books. He wanted to write a bestseller, and he decided to come up with the concept of Atzilus because it sells books and you have a whole other mystical world, and people were thinking, oh, really, if I climb up on a tower 50,000 light years up and then to the left, I'll get to Beriyah. No. The Frierdiker Rebbe says these worlds are a concept which we've known about from Chazal for a very, very long time. We have all of these references to a yeshiva up there, whatever that means, not a physical yeshiva, not that you climb up on a ladder, you get to the 50th floor of the yeshiva. That's not what it is. You have Rabbi Shimon Levi going into Gan Eden. You know Gan Eden existing as some kind of realm of Chal. There's a lot of references about that. Frierdiker Rebbe was looking more for references of people actually going there. Moshe Rabbeinu was there. It was in the upper realms. All of these things, we know about the concept of worlds, and the Frierdiker Rebbe quotes Ma'amar Chazal, I'll seal the deal, there's an infinite amount of them. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says to them, where are these four worlds? What's the point? Where are we getting these four worlds from? What's their significance if there's an infinite amount of worlds? And to that says the Frierdiker Rebbe, these worlds are divided into categories. And when we say Atzilus, we're referring to one category of world. When we say Beriyah, we're referring to another category of world. And when we say Yetzirah, we're referring to another category of world. And when we say Asiyah, we're referring to another category of world. Says the Frierdiker Rebbe that really, Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, in a sense, we've answered both of the questions that we started out with. Frierdiker Rebbe is going to go on a whole long explanation about this. But so far, the two questions that we had is, if you tell me that there's no spatial division between worlds, what is it that distinguishes them? And then the second question was, how does this relate to Seviv and Mamali? Frierdiker Rebbe, with this, technically speaking, he's done. He finished. He answered the question. Or he answered the questions, plural. What is it that makes them distinct from one another? I'll tell you very simply. There's infinite worlds, and of those infinite worlds, I could draw a line. Some of them are revealed vis-a-vis this world, some of them are not. The two upper ones are going to be Atzilus and Beriyah, and the two lower ones are going to be Yetzirah and Asiyah. That is one division. We happen to divide each one down into two other parts. We'll get to that in Rayatz Hashem. But so far, we're good. I've explained to you. Now, what's the distinction? They both occupy the same space. Well, we're gonna get to those details in Rayatz Hashem soon. Not soon today, but soon in the near future of weeks. But there's this distinction. Is not spatial. This distinction is in regards to level. It's in regards to merit. It's in regards to how lofty or how revealed it is. That is what distinguishes them. That's the answer to the first question. The second question is, how does this exist vis-a-vis Uri and Seif and Mamalik and Seif Kolman? Very simple. It exists perfectly with them. Mamalik Kolman is this concept of levels going down and down until you finally reach this lowly world. Exactly. That's exactly what these worlds are. It's from the highest of the high of the infinite worlds to the lowest of the low of the infinite worlds. We've just made a distinction between different categories of worlds, but they exist within the framework of Mamali and Seviv. How does it differ? Mamali and Seviv are two more general concepts. You could say these worlds exist more in a way of Mamali. You could say that certain worlds maybe correspond in the system of correspondence that I referenced before. You could say that some maybe Atzilus would correspond more to Seviv, and the lower worlds would correspond more to Mamali. But ultimately, they exist within the framework of Mamali and Seviv. Not that they're different or distinct. They're categorizations. These worlds are categorizations of an infinitude of worlds that we know that exist from Chazal. This is, I would say, the introduction to the concept of having four worlds. And in Rayatz Hashem, the rest of what we're going to be discussing, I don't know, I'll say the point, but the rest of what we're going to be discussing is all of these worlds, what they mean, what these categorizations are. We refer to them as worlds. It's much easier to think about it as different categories. You wouldn't say that this world that exists with all of the maybe pocket universes or pocket dimensions that exist, you wouldn't say, oh, they're different places. We try to frame things in an easy and understandable way, and it's much easier to think about the whole class of worlds that exists within the category of Beriyah as being Beriyah. And it's just the way that we as humans, we like to put things into categories and to think about them. And it's going to make things very easy to understand as we're going to be explaining Rayatz Hashem, the four worlds of Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. Chazak. Something I'd like to add, which actually ties in Rayatz Hashem, we'll see that at the end in the last episode. But something I'd like to add is a lesson that we could take from this, that the Frierdiker Rebbe shows us, that whatever question we're asked, whatever interactions we have with people, we should always try to view what they're saying as the pinnacle of what it is, whether it was intended by them or not. It's not for us to decide, it's not for us to judge. Ultimately, we should try to view everything as being amazing and fantastic when it's coming from someone else. And ultimately, we can see from this saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a very long and fascinating letter to explain these questions, which may have not been intended by the person who asked them originally, but ultimately, we 100 or so years later, a little bit less, but many, many decades later, we get to appreciate the fruits of the Frierdiker Rebbe's writing, which came from these questions, whether or not they were very intellectual. And I think it's a beautiful and brilliant thing that when we view people in this light, so many good things are able to come out of it. Like this series. So remember, this does come relevant, ties in at the end of Hashem, but a very good lesson for us, regardless of whether or not it would tie in. Chazak.